So I'm Jeetu Patel. Welcome, everyone. I run the Syncplicity business unit at EMC, which is a product offering very similar to Dropbox, but designed more for secure enterprises rather than just consumers for backing up photos. And so what I thought we'd do today is walk you through a little bit of the market trends around what's happening in mobility as it pertains to file sharing and file access. And the problem I'm going to talk about, actually, when you think about it logically, should have been, addressed several years ago. But I think the market's just starting to get really ripe as far as good solid solutions coming into play. So I thought I'd walk you through what some of the challenges in the public sector around this are, and what we're seeing in the market as far as macro trends around mobility and file access, so to say. So just to talk a little bit about what the larger level kind of problem space that we're trying to address is, and we're talking about over here, is fundamentally everyone has multiple devices. I'm sure all of you folks have a smartphone and a tablet device, so on and so forth. So you have on average about 3 to 7 devices, and usually people want their files across all of their devices, right? And more importantly than that is once you have your files across all your devices, you also want to be able to share those files with people both within your organization as well as folks outside the organization. And you want to be able to do that in a way that's simple enough, and if you change those files in one area, you want to make sure that those propagate across so that you don't have to worry about keeping on emailing things back and forth. Now, the largest collaboration system known to mankind to date is email, right? And most people use email for doing this, which is great, except for email isn't designed to do this at scale. And so all of us face a level of frustration when we have a group of people that we want to go out and share files with, and then one person changes it, and that person that changes it now has to propagate an email with a large attachment, and that attachment gets put in the file, but the attachment size is too large, and so my corporate firewall won't allow me to go out and send a file with that large an attachment. So then the email bounces back, and now it's 2 minutes before I have to actually hit the deadline, and so then I go out and put an FTP site in, or I do it with a consumer system like Dropbox, and before you know it, you've created there's a whole big mess, right? And this seems like a very common problem that's been persisting for a while. And the level of productivity loss that comes about from this kind of behavior is pretty enormous, right? And so that's the central problem that we'll talk about today on how that's getting solved as you go into different kind of use cases within the public sector as well as in the private sector for that matter, right? What you also see over here is very specific, unique pressures that face state and local governments today, things like mobile policies. Right now, you're not only seeing these challenges with file access occur within organizations, but there's this whole notion of consumerization of IT and people wanting to buy their own devices and bring their own devices to work. So, there's numerous flavors of devices that are now available, and most consumers have an expectation, whether they're government workers or in the private sector, to be able to use those devices to access corporate data, whether it be email, whether it be files that you might want to go out and use. So the policies that IT has to put in place on other people's devices need to be pretty carefully thought through. And you can't go out and take control of a device that you don't own completely, but you want to be able to take control in a very targeted way of the data that you own that's on that device, so that if that individual is no longer an employee of your organization or the agency, that data doesn't go and leak when they leave the organization and go to a separate entity of some sort, right? Citizen demands are pretty interesting as well. There's increasing caseloads that are out there. There's more and more citizens that need to have access to information from state and local agencies. To the citizens. How do you go out and do that in an organized manner? Large field workforces are pretty common, and then you also have data protection needs, and how do you go out and protect the data that's sensitive in nature, right? So there's gradations of sensitivity of data, and how do you go out and protect different levels of data that have different levels of sensitivity. The other areas that you start to think about as far as use cases are licenses, applications, forms, reservations, all kinds of different documents that need to be shared with people, both on the field as well as at work. And this whole notion of, I am now the demarcation between what am I doing at work and what am I doing for pleasure is starting to blur a little bit, right? People are working while they're out with their families and they want to send a quick email out to someone. You know, true story, one of our people in our staff was recently at in Florida with his kids at Disney World. And he was literally on a line about to get on a roller coaster. And we had an executive meeting, and there was a file that we needed that he had that we needed to get from him, right? And all he had on him was a phone. And I texted him real quick. I'm like, hey, do you happen to have the file? I didn't know that he was on vacation at the time. And literally within about 3 or 4 minutes, I get a link to a file that I was able to download. And later on, I find out he was just about to embark on a roller coaster ride with his daughter, right? And those kind of use cases make it pretty interesting to see. If you have the right systems in place, the boundaries start to blur between, you know, and people are more productive while alleviating the level of stress that they might have in their daily lives, right? And so if you think about what's starting to happen within organizations right now is because these are such highly sought after solutions, most individuals have gotten frustrated with what IT has provided them from an organizational standpoint. So what they've done is they've said, you know what, I don't have what I need, so I'm just going to go out and get something from the App Store within Apple, or I'm just going to go out and get a consumer-based tool. And so they go out and start using these consumer tools, which is great for them, but now IT has no way to control policy and intellectual property around those tools. And so you've got this kind of scenario that you've reached where 70% of IT professionals know or suspect that consumer tools are being used against policy by individuals. And the reason that that's happening is because there's no better alternatives that have been provided to them thus far, right? And so what ends up happening is this scenario where you've got this notion of a choice that organizations have to make between choosing data security and data compliance and protection of information on one end, or choosing that the users can be productive. And those seem to be mutually exclusive choices that you've actually made available to both you know, the public sector and the private sector to say, well, if you want to be really secure, don't allow your users to be productive. And if you want your users to be productive, get used to the fact that you're not going to be secure. And that just seems like a wrong choice for an organization to make. You should be able to have your users be productive while being secure, right? And so that duality that exists right now in the marketplace is an unhealthy behavior that's getting propagated in the market, because you shouldn't, so the way that people are solving this problem is consumers go out and get these consumer-grade tools, and we'll use, you know, Dropbox as a proxy, right? So they will go out and get these consumer-grade tools, and they start using them and they love them. Then IT discovers that, oh boy, these consumer-grade tools are being used and I have no control over my data. And so IT goes out and blocks the use of these consumer-grade tools. And so now users get frustrated. So first thing is the users are now frustrated because the tool that they really like to use, you've actually blocked. And so what users do is they go out and get a MiFi device at work. So rather than going out and going through your corporate network, they get a MiFi device, they turn off the corporate network, and when they're working, they actually start using the MiFi device, right? So that they can continue to use that tool. And this behavior continues to perpetuate where one person tries, it's kind of like the radar detector when you're speeding, right? You go out and have a speed limit, so people want to speed, so they go out and speed, but cops start to clock you on your speed, so then there are radar devices that come out that say, oh, I'm going to figure out when the cop is around because that's when I'm not going to speed. And so they go out and put the radar device on, so the cops get even smarter and they go out and get radar devices that can beat and have more of a stealth mode to the radar devices. And so this kind of is a never-ending cycle, right? The way to stop this is not by protection of not using these tools, but by providing alternatives that might actually get the consumer more excited about being more productive. The primary kind of emphasis has to be how does a user get productive, but not ignoring security, compliance, protection of data, so on and so forth, right? So that's the fundamental philosophical kind of behavior that we are starting to see move about in the cloud is you're going to start seeing a lot of these consumer tools that don't really have a DNA for information protection and information security that need to get addressed, but those have to get addressed not at the expense of the user, but in fact, if you do it right, should enhance the experience of the user. from a security perspective. So we'll talk a little bit about that and how that works, right? So what we are starting to see right now is this big movement that's going on in the market around this whole notion of syncing files across your devices, being able to share them freely across firewall boundaries, so you don't need to just share them with people within your organization or agency, but also outside the organization. And then being able to collaborate as well as you move forward. So what are the considerations that you as a government agency should be thinking about as these technologies start to evolve within the marketplace? And that's what we'll talk about here. And so, you know, the first question to ask is what exactly is it that from a government standpoint at an institution level do organizations and governments and agencies need to go out and serve as the primary requirements for this kind of need being met? So the first one, and you start to see this in cloud-based applications and mobile applications quite a bit, is the expectation of what constitutes a good product is materially changing. So if you think about in the past, users used to have to just put up with really badly written software that was not intuitive for the user. You know, today my 74-year-old mother, who barely speaks any English, cannot survive without broadband for a single day because she has an iPad and she's got a Mac and she's got a laptop and she orders groceries online, and you know, this lady can barely construct a sentence. She has a really hard time and feels nervous when she goes into the grocery store because she doesn't want to talk. She's conscious about speaking in English with people. But at home, she can go out and point and click and you know, order things from Amazon, and it goes on my credit card, so it's sometimes painful, but you know, by and large, it's actually amazing to see how lives have changed, right? So what we think are the core pieces that organizations need in this new generation of software are three things. First one is this whole notion of a frictionless user experience, which means take away the pain when people use technology, and ideally take away any kind of friction that exists when they're using it. It should be more of an enabler rather than a preventer. And in most of these systems, whether it be a document management system or information management system, there's far too many extra steps and far too much clunky behavior that, as a result, prevents users from being productive, and by the end of it, prevents, you know, kind of creates a level of loss of productivity in users, even though the initial intent was to make them productive. So how do you think about creating a frictionless user experience, and how do you, as a government institution, evaluate technologies that actually take away the friction from the use of these technologies, right? The second one is the security and manageability aspect. You can't go out and deploy systems in enterprises and in institutions that don't have the right security in place. Even if it's for consumers, you're eventually starting to see that security is getting more and more of an important factor because of identity theft and so on and so forth. But it's more so on the business side than ever before, because as you start seeing, you know, even if you have the same individual accessing the same files on the same device, the fact that they might be in China versus America, you might have a different security policy in place. You know, if I'm in China as Jeetu trying to access a file on my device, on my Mac, I should have a different kind of behavior of the system than when I'm in the US, just because of the fact that there's higher risk of intellectual property protection in China than the US, and so my IT system should be designed to be able to go out and account for that, right? And then the last one is choice of storage from a compliance perspective. Oftentimes what we're seeing right now is cloud is a big deal. In the government, more and more companies are moving to the cloud. There's a lot of comfort and attraction towards SaaS-based applications, which are hosted in the cloud where you don't have to worry about the infrastructure, but there's a lot of apprehension around your data, sensitive data being put in the cloud. So ideally what you want to do is have the best of both worlds and make sure that the applications have all the benefits of being in the cloud, but that your files can in fact be in your control in your data center if you so choose to have. And so those are the three kind of macro level things that we wanted to talk about and say, you know, what can you talk about meaningfully in 45 minutes? Let's have each one of these discussions and see what we can, where we see the innovations occurring in the market. So in the frictionless user experience, there's essentially two main things to think about in frictionless user experience. The first one is you of course need to have a delightful user experience, because users kind of find that in the consumer grade applications, and the same people that use this at home actually go to work. there are oftentimes companies think of, well, that's a consumer and this is a business user. Well, it is the same human being. He goes home or she goes home and works at stuff at home with their kids. Then they come into work and they find this massively degraded experience because it's so easy to share photos online on Facebook when you go home. And now you come into work and you can't send a document out to someone because it's a little larger in size, and you can't even figure out how to get it to your coworker because it's the email disaster that we talked about, right? So the first dimension over here is, can you provide a delightful user experience? The second dimension is, in most areas when technologies tend to fail from an adoption standpoint in organizations, it's not because the technology doesn't work. It's because the amount of change you impose on users is so disruptive that users say, you know what, this isn't worth it, I'm just going to do it the old way. And I'll go back to my mother's generation. I mean, it took a while for me to convince her that it was a good idea to go out and use the internet. But once the friction was taken away and she could start using it easily, and the reason she started using the internet easily was because there was no training required. When it's blue and it's underlined, you click. There's nothing else you need to do, right? And so in this whole notion, the second piece is to remove the friction. What you should do is remove any extra steps that the users need to take. And rather than keeping on giving them and introducing brand new paradigms of the way that they should work, can have them work the way that they've always worked, but work in the background so that you're almost invisible to the way that users work, right? So this is an example of the way that we think about design in our organization, where if you think of a folder that you might have on your desktop, what is your interface for the folder? If you're using a Windows device, it's typically your file manager or your Explorer. If you're using an Apple device, it's your Finder, right? You shouldn't have to have another interface that's now imposed on you on top of that. If those are your interfaces for how you navigate files and organize files, that should continue to be your interface, right? There's no extra steps that you need to take for doing anything else. Continue to use that interface, but now make sure that there's something working in the background that's much easier, so that now when you mark something as a Syncplicity folder, that automatically now can put that set of content across all of your devices, whether they be within your firewall, or if you want to share it with people outside of the organization, you can share it with people outside the firewall, right? It should be that simple. There should be no extra step, just a right click and say, add this to Syncplicity. That's the only thing you do, nothing else. And so that's kind of a core philosophical thing that we think about is, make sure that there's no extra steps for the user and continue to keep working and organizing information the way that you've always been organizing it. If you do that, coupled with a delightful experience, what ends up happening is your adoption levels tend to skyrocket. So you tend to see that there's hundreds of thousands of users that start using this within no time, millions of users that start using it because there's just a level of ease with which they can start to get productive without having a whole lot of effort that's imposed on it, right? The second notion is around this whole notion of, this whole concept of security and manageability. So the first one, the frictionless user experience, is more so a critical need of the user. Now, going back to the duality of, do we choose for the user to be productive or the organization to be secure? We believe that that's not a choice you should be making. You should be doing both, right? So we talked about the user being productive. Let's talk about the organization being secure. So on the organization being secure, there's a series of things that need to happen to make sure that the organization is secure. So for example, and these are just some basic examples on what you ought to think about. At a macro level, expectation around what your governance policies are for information are pretty important, right? So when we think about the security side, if you currently have an Active Directory implementation internally within your organization and users have a user ID and password, you shouldn't have to then require the user to have a separate user and ID and password for another system that you just added on. It should just work with that user ID and password. If an employee leaves your organization, then it should reflect into the system that that employee has left the organization, and you should automatically be able to deprovision their account so that they no longer can use that account once they've left the organization without much work having to be done. Once you've changed one area, all the applications should then automatically go out and reflect that change, right? If you have this whole notion of adaptive security, which is what we're talking about, which is I need to adapt to what you might be doing and what your context is of the way you're working, and then based on that apply levels of security so that I can assess the risk. The earlier example we talked about, so in our system you can configure it in such a way that if John Smith has a PC or an iPad and they decide to open a file in San Francisco, they'll be able to open it without a problem once they've signed in for the credentials. Now they take that same iPad and John Smith decides to fly to China or Iran, and then they decide to open a file in China. The system detects that John Smith is now in China or in Iran, and these are flagged as red zones within the company. And so they automatically get a second factor of authentication, add an additional PIN or something of that sort that can be put up so that you have this level of additional, kind of security layer that can be added to it. So that's an example of adaptive security rather than just going out and having two factors of authentication every single time. When chances are, if they're within the organization, you might want to make sure that you can create a level of ease and remove the friction from there. But the moment they go outside, you go out and add the capabilities. The second one is around control. How do you make sure that policies for who people are able to share information with, who people are not able to share information with, is not just something that you rely on the user, but you might actually exercise some judgment yourself, right? So you might want to make sure that there are certain agencies that might not want to go out and share information outside of the agency. There are certain that might want to. Those are things that you can have restrictions on by policy that you can apply to behaviors around sharing, behaviors around usage, behaviors around what you're going to do when, when you want to have a mass level of consumption of that capability. And then the third area that's pretty important, and so we're moving into this kind of world of what we call software as a service, right? Rather than software being available as just CDs that I ship to you as an organization. And the big difference in software as a service is the economics are much more so consumption-based rather than purchase-based. So we're one of the first few SaaS divisions at EMC, right? And typically in software companies in general, the big kind of compelling event is when someone buys something, because that's when you get an order and that becomes a compelling event. In our business in SaaS, getting an order is actually not that consequential. Because the way that a transaction, we recently closed a several thousand seat deal with an organization. But that was not as consequential an event as the fact that they started with a 25 seat pilot. Then they went to a 50 seat pilot. Then they went to a 200 seat pilot. From 200 seats, they went to a 500 seats, 1,000 seats, 4,000 seats, eventually to 40,000 seats. As they get to that larger number of seat count, every single phase gate that they had, the key part over there is deployment and engagement of the user. Because with SaaS, one of the things you can do that you couldn't do otherwise is you can actually track what the user engagement level is. Are people actually using these technologies you're giving them? Or have they just been installed and they've never launched it, right? And so this whole notion of deployment is pretty important from the standpoint of how do you go out and get broad number of users, every single employee within your organization, to have this thing deployed. Because in SaaS, unless you get this deployed, the pricing model in SaaS moves all the risk from the buyer to the seller. So in the traditional software world, how would it work? You would buy a large kind of set of licenses, and then you would pay maintenance every year for those licenses on a subsequent basis, right? But the moment you purchase the licenses, the incentive structure for the seller wasn't really there, because whether you deployed it or not was up to you. It wasn't up to us, right? Now what's happened is on the subscription model, that risk profile changes. If you buy a few licenses and if you don't deploy them, you turn off your subscription service. It's like a cable company, right? So the risk is entirely on us. So what happened is the alignment completely occurred between the seller and the buyer in saying, both of us are only successful when the deployment occurs. right? How many times in the traditional software world have you really seen someone care after they've sold the licenses that your deployment happens? Your job's on the line, not ours, right? Now what's happened is it's completely changed. My job is just as much on the line, because if I don't go out and create the level of subscription discipline, and if I don't go out and have massive deployment, nothing happens. So this whole notion of deployment and engagement around the deployment is super important. So the largest team that we have right now, one of the largest teams that's focused maniacally on something is called customer success. And we don't have this whole notion of pre-sales and post-sales anymore. The customer success team's sole objective is two things. Go out and deploy, and once you've deployed, make sure that the engagement of the user is pretty high, so that they're using it and getting value from the system. The moment you start seeing that the value from the system is starting to dip, that means your product's not going out and meeting the promise, and you need to do something with the product to go out and increase that value, right? That's a materially different kind of mindset from a software standpoint than what used to be in the past, right? So that's the third thing. The fourth one is around support. How do you go out and make sure that once you've deployed this to multiple users, and here's a challenge I'll give you. So if let's say 50,000 users start deploying this, right? And we'll talk then about millions of users deploying it in a second. 50,000 users start deploying a piece of software. And now each one of them have about 3 to 5 devices each, right? And they want to be able to make sure that they can access the files across all the devices. So now they have that software installed on all their devices. Now, I don't know about you, but I've probably lost at least about 3 or 4 phones in my lifetime, right? And it was fine when it was just a phone. Then the phone started carrying your address book. So that became a little bit of a problem, because now my personal address book is available to anyone who purchases it. Now it's gotten worse, because now I have a phone, and this phone, for example, which is 16 gigabytes of a phone, has about 35 gigabytes of data or files that I have access to on my machine that I can get to from this phone. If I leave this in a cab, all the confidential documents and my compensation plans and our M&A stuff on the companies we are about to buy, and all of that stuff can be exposed to anyone who wanted it, right? Because I've left the phone there. So what do you go out and do? So one of the things that you need to have in systems is the way to support those, so that if you lose a device, you can target wipe that device, right? You need to have another scenario, which is if you lose a device, if you don't lose a device, but if I choose to discontinue that device and I decided to give my iPad to my daughter and get a new iPad, I don't want to target wipe the device. I just want to target wipe the business documents that I have on that device, right? If I leave the organization, I want to target wipe every single device on which I have my business documents. If I have a contractor that I've gone out and kind of contracted with, I might want to make sure that we might rehire him again, so he needs to keep those documents, but I'm going to disconnect him from any further information that I give him beyond his contract. These are all different use cases that you might have that you want to enable, and you need to have a system that's sophisticated enough to be able to take care of all of these, right? And then lastly is the reports on the monitoring. One of the things you start seeing over here now is there's a lot of talk around big data within the market right now as well. There's a lot of data that's getting generated in different areas. One of the big areas that you start seeing a lot of data being generated is how are people using software? So one of the things we do now is we actually have instrumentation that says the way that we decide, what's very important is what gets added as a feature in the product. What's even more important is when a feature is not getting utilized, how you take it out so that you don't complexify the user experience. You keep a few things, because the moment you get a piece of software to a state where you right-click on something and there's 24 choices to pick from, you failed as a user experience person, because you need to have 2 or 3 things that you can get to, right? And it has to keep being simple. The moment you start making it too complex, you've lost the ability to deploy it to 95% of your organization's employee base, right? In the government, in the public sector, what you also see is certain use cases where you might have citizens that you want to communicate with that are outside of the agency, but that the agency has a responsibility to communicate with. And they want to have certain documents that they want to be able to send out to any citizen that so chooses to subscribe to, right? Those are people outside of the organization. Those might be millions of people outside the organization want to get that information. How do you go out and do that in a way that's simple, easy, and they always have the latest document at the latest time? as you move forward. Those are all kind of use cases to think about as you folks are thinking about how this is going to evolve in the future. So, and then the last one is, what does the government need is choice on storage. So this is a topic that's near and dear to us because of what we've seen customers come back to us with and talk about. So if you think about how this works, I'll give you an example. So this online file sharing market now has become a pretty hot market. So there's numerous vendors that have solutions around it. And the one that defined this category in the consumer side was Dropbox. You know, and we believe that we're one of the first ones to define it on the enterprise side, but on the consumer side was the Dropbox guys. And what they had, we think of this as the first wave. You might have an agency and you might have another agency and you want to be able to make sure that you can communicate documents interagency or with citizens, right? And the way that Dropbox worked is they worked in the public cloud and their storage was in the cloud as well, which was great, except that if you have sensitive documents that you don't feel comfortable putting in the cloud, you didn't have a choice because you had to put everything in the cloud, right? The way that what this did was it provided consumer-grade usability, but didn't provide enterprise-grade compliance and security. That was completely missing in that kind of wave of the providers that were out there. Now what you're seeing coming out, and, you know, I'm not completely objective in this model because we actually designed this and this is our, you know, this is something that we do, but the model that we see over here is in this whole notion of public cloud orchestration. Think of a product like Syncplicity, which is the one that I represent, being over there. And you could have a choice of either having your storage being in your data center or the storage being in the cloud while the system operates in the cloud. So what are the benefits of the system operating in the cloud? You don't have to manage the system. On average, our innovation cycles are much faster in the cloud than they are in on-prem software. So typically in on-prem software, you have a release that happens every 18 months, right? You might have a service pack that happens every 6 months or 7 months, but that's not feature enhancements, that's just kind of bug fixes. In the SaaS environment, we do a release of product every month, every 4 weeks, right? So, and users have started getting used to it. How many of you have iPhones here, right? Most of us. If you go to your updates in your app store in the iPhone, every couple days, if you have a lot of apps, they'll say, well, there's an app update because there's something that's happened. And I kind of like that because every once in a while I see some new features that are going to be more useful to me. So it's like, oh wow, this is great. I updated it and now I can do this that I couldn't do in the past. That's kind of a behavior that users are starting to get used to, which is I want to see continuous innovation and continuous improvements when there are things that, rather than me waiting for 18 months before the next release comes out, right? You can only do that in SaaS. You cannot do that in on-prem software because think of how many people you would deploy it to. There's no way to go out and do that in on-prem software. You can only do it if there's a single instance running in the cloud, right? So what this allows you to do now is have the ability to have a SaaS-based application while it still has the ability to have storage that's on-prem, or you can have storage in the cloud as you please as you move forward, right? And so what it allows you to give, what it gives you is consumer-grade usability, but enterprise-grade compliance. So if you have data residency laws, or if there are certain pieces of data that you always need to keep within your data center because you don't want to have that available in the cloud someplace, now you're able to do that because this is all going to be data in your control, but the application that can be managed by someone who is an expert at managing the application. And so this last piece we kind of talked about, what we have over here is, you know, the ability with Syncplicity to have the internet that stores, we have 3 components to our system, right? So one of them is the clients themselves, the second one is what we call the orchestration layer that sits in the cloud, and the third one is where the storage of the files is. And the storage of the files can be within your firewall, within your domain, behind the VPN or in front of the VPN, whichever way you choose to have it. And everything else sits in the cloud. And so you don't have to worry about your files and your data being exposed. If there's a breach, you'll still have your files in your data center that are encrypted. And if, but your, all the benefits of agility and leverage of someone else's talents can be done through the cloud, right? So if you think about where we are in this market, and then let's just have some active discussions and talk about, you know, what this market's moving to. The first one is end user expectations are changing. On average, people have 3 to 7 devices. People want to make sure that they have access to the enterprise systems from the devices that they might go out and purchase. And when they do that, they want to be able to make sure that the experience is completely easy to use, just like it is for, it should be as easy for you to share files as it is for you to share photos on Facebook with your family, right? That's the benchmark, right? The second one is, while you're doing that, administrative experiences for the user have to be extremely simplified, right? I mean, for the IT administrator have to be sophisticated enough so that you can have the knobs and dials that you can turn to really control how the users can be set up within their organization. Every agency, every government institution is going to have different requirements. If you go to NASA versus the state of California versus someone else, they're going to be very different requirements that different agencies have. And then the last one is the security, governance, and compliance. The other piece that you start to see over here is the worst mistake you can make as these consumer tools start to come about is ignoring those. The most insecure move you can make is by saying, I'm just going to lock this down and not allow my people to use that, because what people do is now find a way around it, like we talked about, and that's going to have the largest risk of information loss and information protection. So what you have to do is make sure that you can block that behavior, not by blocking the access to the system, but by providing an alternative that's a viable alternative from IT to the users. And the pace at which IT can respond to these is not based on what the project pipeline is on your end, but it's going to be based on how quickly the users are adopting stuff on the consumer side. If the users are adopting it fast enough, you need to move fast enough on your end, otherwise you'll actually start putting your information at risk. You're no longer able to control how quickly information can be protected when users start to have their minds of their own and they can go out and provision an application. The thing that's different today versus 5 years ago, users didn't have a choice. They weren't able to just go out and provision an application, so they kind of, hemmed and hawed about it, and they didn't like the idea, but there was nothing that they could do to create damage at a material level, whereas now you're able to create massive levels of damage because of these consumer tools that are out there. So with that, I'll kind of, say that the final piece over here is, to streamline services, improve response times for your users, and make sure that you ensure compliance. There's a fair number of solutions now, and a fair number of options that are available to you in the market as large companies like EMC have gotten into the fray, that hopefully you folks are able to explore some of these alternatives that weren't available to you in the past. And then the other thing that we've done a pretty kind of maniacal job on is, and this is not just Syncplicity, right? We're not unique over here, everyone does this, but it's important that when good ideas like this come about, the first thing you do is start out by having a few group of users just use it in a trial mode, and you shouldn't have to pay money for that. You should just be able to go on the website, download trial software, be able to use it, and see how that works. And if that actually works well, and if people respond well to it, then you know that you can expand the usage of it. And we do this, a lot of other companies that are in this business do this as well. But that's something that we'd encourage you to do, is just make sure that you can start using these capabilities, because the pace of innovation has gotten so different now that you have these alternatives that you didn't have in the past. And the alignment of the objectives of the vendor and the buyer have completely changed, where the vendor is very motivated in your success rather than just closing a deal. Because the deal closing doesn't really do anything if you don't have adoption, because at the end of the year, you're not going to renew the subscription. You can just walk away because no one's using the stuff, and that actually has pretty large. On the other hand, if you actually renew the subscription on an ongoing basis, the vendor benefits, because they don't have to keep buying, they don't have to keep going out and getting new customers. Your existing customers can be ones that can be focused on in farming and nurturing. So with that, I'll open it up to questions if you folks have any, and kind of talk about whether this was valuable at the highest level. Okay. Well, hopefully this was worth your while, and if there's any other questions, by all means, let us know. Go to syncplicity.com. You can try this out for free, so it doesn't cost you anything to try it out. Just you can start using it, and if you're an individual user, you can use it for free for up to 2 gigabytes as well. If one of the use cases over here that we talk about is agencies want to share information with their citizens. And you know, you don't have to pay for the citizens for licensing on that front either, because you can actually buy it in such a way that you just buy it for your own agency, and then sharing information for the citizens. Citizens can go out and download a free version of it and they can use it. And the storage, by the way, this is something that Dropbox doesn't do. The storage, let's say you want to share 100 gigabytes of information or 20 gigabytes of information with the citizen, right? But the citizen has a free version which only holds 2 gigabytes of information. Do they have to pay now? No, you don't require them to pay, because what happens is whatever you share with the citizen does not count against their storage. So that's completely free to them. And all they have to pay for is for the photos that they back up. That might be up to 2 gigabytes, but you can share with them unlimited amounts because you are a paid user and you are an organization that's paid for this, an unlimited amount with the citizens, which at some point in time you decide that you want to take away because you want to now delete that share. You can propagate that delete to all your citizens, so that's an old version, so that can just go away and be blown away. Thank you for your time, folks. Hopefully this was worthwhile.